speakers and learning material. Questions you might have are to be sent using the chat feature for today's webinar. To ask questions in the chat, please click on the chat icon. You will have the option to send your question to everyone or privately to individuals. Questions will be collected throughout the presentation and answered during the Q&A portions of the day. Concerning CE credits, we are using Zoom as our virtual platform, and a CE certificate code will be provided at the end of the presentation, along with the link for CE credit. OPA staff will cross-reference the survey evaluation form to the attendance list after the webinar is completed. There are strict guidelines on how participants are approved for virtual CE credits. Following the presentation, OPA will send a follow-up email containing a survey link. At the end, we will do that at the end of today's program. I will also announce a verification code at the end of today's programs. This code you should write down and save. Following the webinar, we will email a survey with a section where you will need to use the verification code. This code is required for everyone requesting CE credits. We will give attendees 2 weeks to complete the survey. CEs will be sent out once the OPA staff has cross-referenced the evaluation and the attendee list. Please allow 3 to 4 weeks for the certificates to arrive. Again, if you want CD, you must complete the survey and use the verification code. Everyone must complete the survey. And with that, let's get started with our presentation entitled Legal and Ethical Update. Paul Cooney is a healthcare attorney who has been in practice for more than 30 years. Mr. Cooney is a partner at Cooney, and Madigan, LLC, where he specializes in healthcare litigation and represents a wide variety of healthcare professionals in all aspects of their practice. Mr. Cooney is general counsel for the Oregon Psychological Association and the Oregon Counseling Association. He represents mental health professionals in malpractice cases, license and discipline, and general business matters. He is licensed to practice in both Oregon and Washington and is a frequent speaker on legal issues and risk management. David Madigan is a healthcare attorney who has been in practice for more than 20 years. Mr. Madigan is also a partner at Cooney, and Madigan, where he represents a wide variety of healthcare professionals in all aspects of their practice. As a healthcare attorney, his practice focuses on defending board complaints, advising healthcare practice on state and federal regulations, including Medicare, HIPAA privacy and security compliance, data breach investigation and defense, antitrust, EMTALA, and Stark regulations, as well as setting up group practices. He also is licensed in both Oregon and Washington, and he is a frequent speaker as well. So with that, we would like to begin our presentation. Please join me in welcoming Paul and David this morning.
Well, good morning, everyone. You get to sit for 4 hours listening to 2 attorneys talk, and so we will try to make it worth your while. We have a lot of participants today, and so we will catch what questions we can. But for attending today's seminar, you get a free half-hour consult to Dave or I, or my brother Tom as our other law partner, and we will get those questions answered. We want to make sure that if you have questions, we'll try to get to them, but the logistics is going to be a little difficult. Part of what Dave and I do are free consults to Oregon Counseling Association, Oregon Psychological Association. There's another listserv that we do it as well. And so we did that so you would have availability for an attorney. So if somebody's telling you, hey, don't turn over the records, or you must turn over the records, or a whole variety of things, subpoenas signed by attorneys aren't valid, all these myths that we hear every year. Dave will go through a lot of those and dispel them. But we want to kind of just set the groundwork for this is the legal side of mental health. And we don't advocate mental health by attorney. Although Dave is available if you need him to sit in with a difficult client for a few sessions, you can hire him and he'll do that for you. But we try to make it practical. We try to make it, well, as practical as you can, dealing with the legal stuff sometimes. But let's get started on, the first topic is managing difficult clients. And I'm assuming none of you have any difficult clients, and so we can skip this entirely and just move on to the next section. When we do these live, I ask people to raise their hand who has clients they don't necessarily like or are difficult, and almost everybody raises their hand. And then we just simply pass 3 names to the left, and now you've gotten rid of your difficult clients for the day. All of this starts with client selection and client identification. Who is your client? And in the calls that I take, it's surprising sometimes when I ask, well, who's the client? So let's start there, because that's defines your responsibilities and everything else, your ethics. And if there is a pause in answering that question, I know it's going to be an interesting phone call, because they may have more than one client. They may have a number of clients. And so we get into more, who is your individual client? Who is your family client? Who is your couple's clients? And so starting with that really kind of makes a difference. And it is not answered by insurance. Often people say, oh, well, it's the designated client through my insurance company. But if you have a couple in there and you're actually doing couples work, working with both of them, they are both your client, whether you're billing one client's insurance or not. And if you treat the other one as a non-client, you've deprived them of a lot of things that clients are entitled to. And so it's who you're doing the work with. And so if the person is just there a couple of times and giving you some, reality checking and feedback on your primary client, then great. Maybe they aren't a client and you should give them a non-client, you're a collateral, here's how it works document. But if they're there every time and they're doing the work with you, then you need to treat them as a client. And you have to clarify at the outset, psychologists require that. The American Counseling Association, ACA, requires that. It requires you to kind of think it through. Who is my client and what potential conflicts might be coming up? Having more than one individual client in your office at a time should set up a red flag saying, what am I doing? Can I do this? Should I consult with colleagues? Should I consult with Dave Madigan? Should I, what should I do? Because that can be a potential problem. When those cases go badly, somebody complains to a licensing board, it's difficult to defend those cases. I talked about the non-patient collateral form. It's just telling somebody who you designate as not my client, instead of just thinking that in your mind and going, hey, they're not my client, so they must assume the same thing. Don't make that assumption. They may be the first time they're in therapy. So they don't know how it works. And so give them a form that says, hey, here's how it works. You're not my client. You're here on behalf of John, my client. What you tell me may go into John's chart. You don't have access rights to John's chart. And if you need somebody as a therapist, I'll give you some names. And so you just tell them the ground rules, that this is not their session, it is John's session. Also avoid switching roles from going to individual to couples, then back again. That is a common problem that generates board complaints. You start with somebody as an individual, then they bring in their spouse, then the spouse drops out, and then you're back to individual again, or some reversal of that. And the person who dropped out feels that you were biased against them because the other person was your individual client before. And so they will often file a complaint. You're the reason we're getting divorced, not because of drinking problems or anything else. It's you, the therapist, caused that problem. And so be thinking of, hey, what could go wrong in this situation? And if you need to address it with a new set of informed consents, then that's absolutely what you should do. That's the most forgotten thing done when people switch roles is they don't sign new informed consents. The most commonly uttered phrase in our office when we're dealing with board complaints is, I was only trying to help my client. Good intentions are great. I mean, it's certainly bad, better than, I'm an evil therapist and I'm, preying on my clients, but it is not a defense. It's a mitigating factor perhaps, but bottom line is good intentions just don't rule the day. You have to kind of understand where the boundaries are and where you're at in relation to them. So if you're meeting clients outside the office, um, good intentions won't help you if you don't chart that encounter. If it's therapeutic, it's intended to be therapeutic, then you got to have it in the chart. Too often we see it as, oh, later, yeah, it was therapeutic and this is why we were doing it, but there's no chart note, there's no billing, there's no anything. It looks like you were having a social outing with your client, or worse. So these are the areas too that things will go wrong when you have a client who is upset with you. They will push you to do things that you maybe wouldn't normally do. They get on social media, they give you a bad review, they do all sorts of things. Those are difficult to counteract because they don't waive their HIPAA rights when they file those types of things. We'll talk a little bit more detail about it later, but be prepared that they can start giving you the 1-star reviews that nobody wants. Just make sure you stick with your role. If you start in as a individual therapist, I would suggest sticking as an individual therapist. People do it and they bring the spouse in and now it's couples, but I would have a conversation, a documented conversation with the client saying, and we will never be individual patient therapist again. If we're bringing your spouse in, we're changing things, confidentiality changes, all sorts of things change. Let's understand that I will not go back to being your individual therapist. You can do it. It's just that our experience over our 50 plus years is it doesn't turn out well. And so try to stick with your role when you can. For example, if you're a child's therapist and they ask you to be the reunification therapist, you now have expanded your obligations to several other people other than your child client. And so that is a significant change in how you interact with these people. And so I would decline that offer. I would say, hey, here's some good reunification therapists, go use them.
Hey, Paul,
Yeah.
when you're moving from role to role, what are your specific obligations with regards to an individual client, and then your obligations when you're doing reunification?
So when you got an individual client, it's your confidentiality is one-on-one. You can, you have the responsibilities, do no harm to this particular client. But now when you go to a reunification therapist, now you have the father and the mother and their rights and responsibilities, and they're often in conflict by definition. And so if it was just the reunification therapist doing their own work and that was their only role they ever had, they can manage all those and treat it as if it's like a family therapy. But if you're the child's therapist, you've got that individual responsibility to that client primary. And then you have other clients now that are, problematic with that. Tell Tom to get to work.
He hasn't seen you in so long.
Exactly. Can you have a friendship after therapy? Technically, it's not prohibited as long as it's not a romantic relationship. Is it a good idea? Not in all cases, certainly. What is it that drives you to do that? Are you feeling isolated? Are you, what's going on with you that would be your choice of a friend? I mean, that's, it's a pool of people you meet. And so, but you would really want to stop and think about it before you do that type of stuff. Again, it's not strictly prohibited, but and the board has passed on any type of discipline in the recent cases that I've been involved in that had that as a dynamic, but I wouldn't recommend it.
Hey,
So
Paul,
you've heard it from me. Yep. Go ahead,
You
Dave.
missed gifts.
Oh, yeah. Gifts come in different um, flavors, I guess is the way to say it. Is they can be lovely little gifts, and it's understandable, and it's de minimis. It's some cookies or whatever it is, but they can also take on a more sinister tone. We once had a person who the client was leaving their favorite soda drink on their car after the session, and then they had a kind of a rough session, and then there was a dead squirrel on their car. Now, it could be just chance that the squirrel upped and died right there on the top of their car. I doubt that's the case. Um, and sometimes clients just don't identify, they give you anonymous gifts. And sometimes they're quite expensive. We had one where we couldn't tell who was giving the gift. We had maybe, 3 clients that it could be, but some of them were quite personal in nature. Some of them were quite expensive. Even the box was wrapped, elaborately. And so trying to figure out how to sleuth that out is, I think the solution we came up with was simply telling all clients, um, you know, while gifts are appreciated and, are well intentioned, our ethics prohibit us from accepting gifts from clients. And so just so you know, they will go to the local women's shelter or, child's care place or whatever it is. But they'll be donated. And then the gifts stop coming. So charting is your number one risk management tool. If you get involved in a lawsuit, that becomes the focus of the lawsuit. Dave and I both have a lot of experience in going through, infinite detail on a chart. One little particular entry becomes kind of the case. Did you really have this conversation? If it's a patient suicide, did you actually do a risk assessment of any kind during that last session? And the problem is you never know when it's going to be your last session. And so what's the chart look like? And that often guides how we handle the case. Licensing boards want to see your notes. And so that means everything. Typically, it includes billing and texts and emails and session notes and psychotherapy notes if you keep them separately. The board wants to see everything and they'll investigate things. And so if you have lousy chart, maybe today would be a good day to say, hey, I swear and affirm that I will do better in my charting. I will find a process that works for me. Maybe it's a fillable template or a printed page that has a bunch of stuff already on it, and you're not writing quite so much. If your handwriting is crap, please figure out a way to get them typed. You can dictate things. You can, if I'm sending an email, I can dictate it on my phone and send it. You want to make sure that you have the HIPAA compliance in there because some of them aren't particularly compliant. But if you drop dead tomorrow too, the continuity of care requires that you maintain a chart and that you have good notes in it. And people who are of the opinion that sparse charting helps the client or protects the client somehow, I will disagree with my dying breath. It puts you at risk, and I think it puts your client at some risk because you don't have the information in there that may be necessary. And it certainly puts you at risk because, if other people are attending and you don't write that down, or there are certain, really important things the client is telling you that come up later in a board complaint, wouldn't it be nice to have a chart note that says what you're saying happened? And so the cases that we defend, the ones with complete notes are always better and easier to defend. Every now and then it will document that, hey, here's a mistake that I made. But it's, you're going to have to admit that anyway. And so having it in the chart makes a big difference. The board does not like sparse charts. They don't like illegible charts. And so be careful with that. They can throw that in as an additional kind of compounding ethical problem. And in this day and age, if you're not charting pursuant to the documentation guidelines, the mental health or behavioral health documentation guidelines for each insurance company, you're just flying blind. You're up there without a net, you're flying blind, any way you want to put it, it's dangerous. you should know what they require in their charts. Start and stop times is a universal one. It has to be in the chart, not on a scheduling document of some sort.
And Paul,
Total
I'd like to
minutes.
know on the insurance companies,
Yeah.
their documentation requirements are not the same for each insurance company. So
Right.
you really have to look at, each panel, what do they require? The other thing I'd also note is even if you're meeting the requirements for the licensing board for ethically documentation, that may not satisfy the insurance company's requirements. So those
And
are
what's
just
the
2
risk,
points.
Dave? So what's the risk, Dave, if you don't chart accordingly and you get audited? What can the insurance company do to you?
They can basically claw back uh, the claims. So, for each session that they say is not sufficiently documented, they can require a refund of that session. And what they tend to do is they'll look at 40 or 50 charts. And then based upon that, they will take the percentage of errors. Errors mean number of charts that don't meet their requirements, and extrapolate that across the universe of all claims you submitted over a period of time. And it's usually 18 months, which can be thousands, tens of thousands, and in some cases over $100,000.
So if you're going to be audited by an insurance company, you need to know what their documentation requirements are. Call them, look on the online. I had Optums for a while, and you have to dig around a little bit, but calling them and asking them, even if they'll share the audit criteria, that would be great. Just tell them, hey, I want to be in compliance. Can you share with me what types of things are being audited? And if they want you compliant and it's not just, hey, we want to get free money as an insurance company, then they should share the audit criteria saying, hey, here's what we expect. We're open and transparent about it. So this myth of less is more, again, just chart better. More detail is better. There may be times when, say, you've got a contentious divorce and the kid is your client. Do you really want to document in detail the things the kid says about mom or dad in various things, as long as it's not abuse? Do you really want to detail that, especially if you know you have a parent who is going to grill the child over the record? Now, there's some changes in access to records. There's a new section on minors that you can choose not to send records to a parent if it's not in the best interest of the child. But Dave will talk about that a little later. But it's, so part of the documentation is you're just not a scrivener. Oftentimes I see a note that is just nothing but, here's what the client told me during the entire session. There was a bad birthday party, or there was a gift that was bad, or this brought back childhood memories of whatever. And there's nothing else in the chart. You're not there just to, document their life and do their, autobiography or their biography. You're there to, one, document some of those things. That tells you the client is bipolar, or tell us, that's one of the things about some of the play therapy notes that I read is it means something to a play therapist, but it does not mean something to a jury or to anyone else. And so oftentimes you have to say the reason it's important that the child wouldn't sit close to father is because of these things, or they picked these particular toys over others. And so you have to explain, otherwise juries do not react well to those, child picked up this toy and this one, and this drawing had this color in it, and those types of things. It just is meaningless to them. And so avoid that when you can. And be thinking in terms of treatment plan. Do you need a treatment plan? How often do you need a treatment plan? You should know all those things. And if you do your own billing, you definitely need to know those things. And if somebody else is doing your billing, you need to know that they know what those requirements are. And so, do I need a pre-authorization for 90837? If it's not PTSD, if it's not complex trauma, it's not a variety of other things. Can I bill that? I know people whose practice is all 90837s, and you get a letter eventually from the insurance company saying, "Hey, greetings, we noticed that you use 90837 more than your neighbors. Um, just letting you know, my guess is you got an audit in your future." And Dave will talk about a little bit, but one of the things is medical necessity. Is this treatment, the way we have it set up, the frequency and so on, the length of the treatment of the session, is this medically necessary for this client? And Dave is kind of the guru on that, and he would, if the insurance company is going to deny claims on that, you need to be able to be prepared to defend those, because it's difficult. I see people all the time with weekly visits, insurance paid clients, weekly visits, sometimes twice a week. They're not suicidal. It's not, crisis intervention. And my question is, you're going to get audited, and can you defend that level of utilization? And your view of what the client needs is different than the insurance company's view of what the client needs. I'll guarantee you that. And so be aware of what they expect, what they want if you're taking insurance. Um, your informed consent sets the tone for working with your client. For example, do you have an assessment period? 3 or 4 sessions, we do an assessment. Put that in your informed consent. I've had cases recently where the client expected, "Hey, you're my therapist, from the get-go, and that's it. And then now you've abandoned me because you sent me off to somebody else." Tell them what your process is and why you have that process. It's to determine if we're a good fit. Don't overpromise on confidentiality. Use may rather than shall. If you say, "I shall report child abuse," problem is there may be nuances to it, and there may be a situation where you wouldn't. And so now you've been in violation of your written agreement with your client. And so use more permissive language if you can. If you use touch in your therapy, absolutely have a policy on it. Write it out, that you ask permission, that you document the reaction to it. There's some criteria that are required if you're using touch as a therapeutic intervention. Or if you're just using it and say, "Hey, I'm a human being, and sometimes I hug clients." Well, talk about that a little bit in your informed consent and let the client know that they're free to opt out of that if they wish. On your fees, keep it simple. Really keep it simple. I know people that have 6 or 8 different fee categories. Okay. And if your fee for litigation is much more than your normal hourly rate, then you might be charged with an excessive fee. I know people do it to discourage people to, say, "Hey, I charge you $500 an hour for litigation." Um, you're being compensated for your time away from the office, and your time at the office would have been charged at your normal hourly rate. It's not like they're asking you to dig ditches and do heavy manual labor. It's you're there to answer about things that you've already been paid for in most cases. What did you do with this client? And so keep your fees relatively simple. Have email and text policies. Dave has had cases where you stand behind the stack of emails and just in 1 year and you disappear. If you've got a client who is excessively emailing you, the problem is you get trapped into starting to answer that stuff instead of just saying, "That's great information, let's talk about it the next session." They start doing therapy by email or text, or you're texting a client on a particularly bad morning, you're feeling rushed, other things are happening, it comes across a little more abrupt than it should. Be very, very judicious with texts and emails if you can. And if you're going to, if they don't hear from a client in 30, 60, 90 days, do you want language in your informed consent that says, "Hey, I'll close my file, and then you can reapply to be a new client again if I have space"? Just letting them know that if they aren't engaged in treatment, that time slot was for them. And so, hopefully they're going to be keeping that. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then talk about how you'll meet, if you meet clients outside the office. Most therapists just don't acknowledge the client. And then clients sometimes think, well, maybe they're mad at me. They didn't say hello. And because clients have the opposite reaction. Hi, doctor. Oh, this is great. This is my therapist. And you're in the grocery line, you know. So just talk about how you're going to approach them or not approach them. If they approach you, what will you do? That kind of stuff. People might know that I'm a therapist. So these are the types of difficult clients. No-show, angry, threatening, suicidal, won't pay their bills. So the no-show client, you can minimize this a little bit by having a conversation with the client. This time slot is reserved for you. Explain kind of how that works. You know, if my client doesn't show as an attorney, I can just go work on another case. That's not true for mental health professionals. In most cases, you get paid on an hourly basis, and here it is. And so also consider having a policy that says if we miss 3 sessions in some period of time, you can terminate treatment. Because if they're excessively missing or calling in, you know, life happens, and some of that you can excuse, but if, you know, their life is so chaotic, you know, you make a decision on that. Do I want to continue with this client knowing that that's the way it's going to be? And if it's not, you're free to terminate. Now, you don't just terminate them immediately that day. You simply say, look, you know, you've missed 4 sessions in the last month. And so we really need to figure out if there's a better therapist for you that's closer to your house, whatever it is that does telehealth. And you know, I'm not doing it. Whatever the problem is, you can resolve it. You can add a no-show fee. I think that's important in some situations, most situations, but it's also a double-edged sword because on one hand, it's discouraging them to miss appointments, but it does increase the potential for board complaints because if they only have missed appointment fees at the end and you're hounding them for those, that creates a problem. And they do not feel that they got good value for that. They think that their excuse was or absence was excused, and you know, doesn't matter if they didn't show and didn't call. They have a very different view on this than you do, and so I would have a generous, you know, I'm not going to charge you once you know therapy ends. The other thing too, well, with suicidal patients, if they're not showing up, you know, depends on where they're at on this spectrum of risk. But you know, are you doing things if they don't show up? Let's say they just don't call. What's the plan? Do you just do nothing? If they're in an acute phase, then you should probably be doing something, and they should know what that would be. If you don't show in the next, you know, month or two, I'm going to call your mother. I'm going to call your work. I'm going to try to, you know, I'm going to call you first and see where you're at. But there's people that are going to be involved and they're going to know you missed a session. So if we don't want to have that, and you have releases for all those people, then you go through that. Or you also have a language in there. If I haven't seen you in 60 days, I'll close your file. Because if they just stop showing up, when did they stop being your client? At day 60? There's nothing in the law that says that. Day 30, day 91, day whatever, you know, it's hard to tell. And this at least puts a definitive end date on it and saying, hey, by automatic operation, we're going to terminate the relationship. So the more interesting clients are the ones that are angry at you and or others, but often at you. If you've made a mistake, apologize for it. It's not an admission of guilt. I hear that all the time. It is not an admission of guilt. If the customer is always right. I'm sorry I was late for today's appointment, Mr. So-and-so. And, you know, here's a $10 gift certificate because I value your time. It's not a, you know, a prohibited gift to a client. It's just recognizing the value of their time. People like, you know, little gift cards. And so I think that's perfectly fine. But be open and candid if you've made a mistake. Consider not billing for that session. And also, are you being effective with this particular client? If this is not the mix that is working for this client, and you may come to a conclusion, this client has had this relationship with every therapist they've ever had, and so it's not surprising they're having it with me. Okay, you can take that on if you wish. You're not obligated to take that on, and people often feel trapped in therapy because they don't know when to terminate with the client, and so you can terminate. Talk about it, saying, "Hey, you clearly don't think I'm a good therapist, and so why don't we talk about getting you to somebody new?" And then set a time for that and make that happen. At that point, if you've determined that you no longer want to work with this client, it is not up to the client whether they continue to work with you or not. You are on a path to termination, and you're just letting them know this is what's going on. They may feel abandoned, but it is not abandonment. In 31 years, I have never had a true abandonment case. Therapists just don't abandon their clients. Every now and then they do it maybe a little more abruptly than they should, but typically they've given them plenty of notice. They've had conversations, but that's where the chart really comes in. You've documented those conversations. You may need a higher level of care client. You may need intensive outpatient. You may need DBT. You may need, a team so that they can deal with your crisis calls after hours. And so those conversations should be documented, and that's your defense to an abandonment case, is what led up to termination. Now, if the client just storms out of the office and says, "Never call me again," chart that, and that's your termination defense. The client left and didn't want me to call them. And then if you refer clients out, are you referring them to friends or foe? It's a little challenging sometimes. Hey, John, I've got this really great client who, wants to kill me in a variety of ways, but I think you'd be a perfect fit for them, or do you just refer them to, hey, your insurance company will have therapists online or, that are on your plan. Oregon Psychological Association has Find a Psychologist. There are resources for people, and you can give them those or give them names. And if the client says, "Don't talk to me," then just write in the chart who you would have referred them to. That way you have it documented in the chart. I would have given these referrals. They told me not to talk to them. I honored that request. So if the clients are actually threatening, they've gone beyond just kind of angry, and now they're threatening you. My favorite one was the client called into the therapist's office and left a voicemail. "I dreamt of your headless body floating down the river last night, and it made me feel better. Can I come in and talk about it?" And the short answer is, no, you can't come into my riverfront office and talk about my headless body. Call Paul Cooney. He'll talk to you. He'll talk you off of all that stuff. They do threats. They sometimes do it in veiled ways. Sometimes they do it overtly. If you find a dead squirrel on your car, is that a threat? It's creepy, but can you really prove that it was that client and all that sort of stuff? And so you get into some of those issues, but bottom line, you trust your gut. And if you need to terminate, you terminate. Oregon hasn't adopted Tarasoff, the California case, which was a duty to warn. Initially, it was a duty to protect or warn, and then it was a duty to warn, and now they've codified it. But bottom line is, Oregon has a separate standard, and it's not really a duty to warn. It's you may if you want to. If the client has a clear and serious intent to commit a future crime involving threat to physical safety, sex abuse, death, or animal torture, you may go tell anyone. Law enforcement, bosses, family members, you name it. You're free to go tell them that limited amount of information. Here's the threat. And you have immunity if you do it in good faith. And so it is, and you have immunity whether you report or you don't report. But if there's a serious risk and somebody might die, then I would absolutely spend some time considering reporting that. talk to Dave or I, talk to, colleagues, but bottom line is you make the determination on the threat risk and then you address that. Suicidal patients, there's some statistics here. I'm just going to kind of go through these. You have access to materials, I think. But I noticed that as a 63-year-old white male who with American Indian ancestry puts me at the top of the chart. So we'll have to worry about that a little later. The documentation requirements, you just have to document more. You have to interact with other professionals in their life, their med provider, AA sponsors, you name it. You should be coordinating care depending on the level of the risk. You use no harm contracts. If we have one, the other side is going to argue they're not worth the paper they're written on. If we don't have one, they're going to say, oh, it's the standard of care. You got to have one. It's a mixed bag, but I think it's an opportunity to talk to your client and, every chance you get to talk about it. Why are they willing to sign it? Why aren't they willing to sign it? Have a safety plan with the client, put it in the file, give a copy to the client. I know a therapist who has a little laminated card that they give to the client for they put it in their wallet so they have it at all times. All the crisis numbers, various, access points. 988 is the new phone number for suicide. You got to do periodic risk assessments. It's just something that you got to do. People often forget to do that, and they just kind of fly by the seat of their pants. But it's been a long time since they really took a suicide class, and so you really got to stay up on that and making sure that you're doing a good assessment. And the benefit of the assessment is not necessarily the number that gets generated, but bottom line is you're having a structured interview with the client and making sure you're covering all the bases. And so make sure you're doing that. Find a good system that works. The CAMS system, CAMS, and if I could remember what that stood for, I would. Suicide management is the part of it, but collaborative assessment and management of suicidality, something like that. Make sure you get signed authorizations from the very beginning. So if you are going to reach out, don't wait until you're suddenly worried about the client and going, oh my God, I gotta call their spouse or I gotta call somebody. You can do that in a crisis, but if it's, hey, they didn't show, I'm concerned because they've had some concerning thoughts recently, but am I enough concerned to breach confidentiality? Get the authorizations up front, have a conversation. If they've had a history of suicide attempts or hospitalizations or chronic suicidality, then get those signed authorizations up front. And if they're not going to give them to you, can you really be effective? Can you really treat this client? And so have a conversation about that. Document the referrals you're giving them. Absolutely. People often say, oh, they wouldn't go for a med management consult because they don't like pills or they tried it in the past and it didn't work. So I don't write anything down. And then the client suicides. And now the question is, why didn't you refer them to drug and alcohol treatment or med management? Oh, I did. Well, it's not in the chart. We think you're lying about it because the client's now dead and you're trying to defend yourself. And that's how blunt they'll be. And so document those referrals, even if the client says no, and document what the client's response is. I would never do that. I would never, take pills. Okay, revisit it. And at some point you have to determine if the client is not going to do the things you recommend for them, are you becoming complicit in their decision-making? And at some point you have to determine, can I be effective with this client? Document positive and negative things going on in their life. Positive things are just as important. And some people go, well, that's a good sign that there's no risk here. And they don't write it down. But that's your defense in case they leave your office and complete the suicide. Be careful with that because you never know when it's going to be the last session. You can't say, I don't treat suicidal patients. That's just, the board doesn't allow it. And you never know when a client is going to become suicidal. And so you really can't screen for that necessarily. And so bottom line is you may end up with a client and you better be competent about it. And so stay current in that, take that CE requirement seriously. Do more than the 1 hour, I think is what they require. Don't wait just to know if there are guns in the house. If that's, been their modus operandi in the past, or if that's what they've been talking about. Talk to family about red flag laws or extreme risk protective orders, ERPOs. The family can sign those and get the guns taken out of the house. That's a whole seminar in itself. Stay current. You can terminate while they're in the hospital. People often think, hey, maybe I shouldn't do that. They're in crisis. But if you've determined, hey, they need a higher level of care because this is the 4th time they've been hospitalized since I've seen them, maybe what I'm doing isn't working or isn't sufficient, and they need something else. And so they're in a team setting, they're in a safe place, arguably, and you need to let the team know, hey, if you're going to release them back out into the wild, it's not going to be to me because I don't have the capacity as a sole practitioner to handle these crisis calls over and over again. So let's problem solve together and figure out what's the next best thing for them. And so if they go to intensive outpatient or something like that, and then maybe when they complete that, they would consider coming back to you for some additional services. Again, you get to make that decision. You may not want them back, and you can make that choice. Clients who won't pay, they want to see you, that's your leverage. So if they want to continue to see you, they'll get on a payment plan. If they want to see you, they'll bring the payment. If they want, things need to happen. And so put them on a payment plan right away. No payment, no session. And if, therapists are wonderful people. I am blessed with the career that I have because I get to talk to you all every day, and it just screams at me, this is a caring person. These are smart people. It's a lovely combination. But sometimes you have a little bit too much of a bleeding heart to say, oh, it's all right that they owe me $5,000 in unpaid fees. I'm helping them. And, if that keeps you warm and fuzzy at night instead of having the gas on in your house, then okay. But you should get paid for your time. It will eventually start to interfere with the therapeutic relationship. And so be careful with that. Manage it up front, not at the end after they've left. Put them on a payment plan and stick to it and be strict. If they're not in crisis and they don't have the money that day, consider not seeing them. Consider not making another appointment until they make a payment on that payment plan.
So
Put it
hey,
in writing.
if they don't pay, they leave treatment, and you want to collect on that, is it a good idea to send them to collections?
You bet. No. Especially not a collections that has the authorization to sue the patient. But I think it's just bad form. And I think you missed an opportunity as a therapist earlier on with your client to manage that accounts receivable in a fair way. Hounding them afterwards is rarely effective. You're going to pay the collections agency half of what you're going to try to get back. It's going to ruin the client's credit. It's going to do a variety of things. And so I would not suggest that, and certainly not sue them in small claims court, because they'll claim malpractice. You didn't do the therapy right, and I don't owe you a dime. And now you have to check the box, have you ever been sued for malpractice? And so you will win that case more than likely. You'll get a little judgment that says, here, the client owes you this amount of money. Now you got to go hire a case years ago where I told them up front, I'll bring this lawsuit on your behalf, but you're going to get a judgment that's not worth anything. And sure enough, we got the judgment. And what I did is I put it in some frames for their wall so they could put them on the wall and just, understand that that's basically all they were going to get out of that case.
Well, what
And
about
that's,
board complaints generated from that?
Yeah, you get board complaints too, because clients, don't think that they owe you the money. They don't think it's fair. They don't think you're a good therapist. All the things that they didn't like that wouldn't have generated a board complaint back then. You were late for some sessions. You said something in a session they didn't particularly like. You thought that was insulting, or demeaning, or culturally insensitive, or you name it. They will all come to the forefront, and then that board complaint happens. And it's basically been generated by that. You're hounding them for money. Clients often put it as, you're harassing me. If you want to go to law school and have your heart removed, then perfect. You can do that. They do that in the first week. It's lovely. Now, this is coming from a guy that donates half his day to free consults. So, don't listen to me. Don't sue them for unpaid fees. Don't send repeated messages. Just, do one or two, send them a bill. If they're going to pay it, they're going to pay it. If they're not, you're free to write it off. At any time, you're free to write it off. And I think that's oftentimes what Dave and my advice is going to be, is time to write this off. Get a credit card on file. Sometimes that works. Sometimes the credit card doesn't run. Sometimes they'll dispute the charge. So if you're going to charge it on a credit card, you need to have a document that says, here's my hourly rate. Client authorizes me to charge this to their credit card, or the copay, or whatever it is that you're going to be charging to that. And so that you have a simple document with the client's name and signature on it that you can send to the insurance or the credit card company saying they authorize that charge. And then if bottom line, if it's not working, you can say, I expect to be paid, and this is probably not the right time for you for therapy. That's a tough thing for therapists to do. I understand that. But bottom line is, there are other people out there that need your help too, that are willing to pay, that are able to pay. And, pick your pro bono cases. Pick your cases where you have a discounted fee. Pick those cases yourself, as opposed to having them imposed on you. So termination, if you're no longer helping the client, or it's harming them, or they're not, being benefited by it, then bottom line, all professions require you to terminate at some point. And how you do it is important. Don't worry too much about patient abandonment, other than to make sure that you're documenting that path forward towards termination. Patients often feel abandoned. That is not an abandonment case. Don't confuse the two. If you've given them plenty of notice, they still want to be your patient, but you don't want to be their therapist, you can terminate. Give them appropriate notice. Send them something in writing if it won't trigger them. It should be short. Don't send a 5-page termination letter. Send a, 1-paragraph patient, therapy. Here are the resources that I provided you. I wish you well on your journey forward. Something like that. Yeah. As an attorney, I wouldn't put that last sentence in there typically, but I felt that, therapists would want to put that in there. So document your discussions. Don't let the client